And now, without further ado, it is indeed my privilege to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Daniel Kroese. He is the Deputy Assistant Director at CISA, National Risk Management Center, focusing on strategic engagement. Earlier at CISA, he led and planned for this first of its kind DHS National Cybersecurity Summit that has been known widely as a groundbreaking moment for enhanced collaboration between the public and private sectors on cybersecurity risk management. Please join me in a warm Electrosoft ITPA welcome to our exciting opening keynote speaker, Daniel Kroese.
Well, Thelma, thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. And first of all, congratulations on assuming your new leadership role at ITPA here, which is very exciting. And I think you described the next 3 hours as being jam-packed. So privileged to be able to kick off the jam-packed discussion here for the next few hours. As Thelma mentioned, I'm the Acting Deputy Assistant Director at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, focused on a lot of our risk management efforts for the critical infrastructure community. Cybersecurity risk management being a huge part of that. And I think when I look at the vantage point from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency compared to the summit title today, Cyber Transformation, really have a unique perspective here to share some thoughts about how this landscape and how this ecosystem is changing and how we can all be part of the collective defense mission together. I think both those words, the cyber and the transformation, are both key and operative when we talk about the shifts that we're seeing here going forward. On the cyber front, it's no secret that in an increasingly digitally connected world, the threat landscape is rapidly evolving, and we all must lean in to be more vigilant against cyber adversaries right now. And at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, we play a role there as the lead civilian cyber agency. We offer assessments to your network, cyber hygiene scans. We have information sharing programs, a suite of capacity building that we offer to organizations. And so on the cyber side, we very much have matured our capabilities and our offerings around the ability of a whole range of stakeholders to better understand the vulnerabilities in cyberspace and how their organizations can ensure they're protected against those. And in fact, we've seen, and it's never something you want to pat yourself on the back for, because it's just reinforcement of the threat landscape. We've seen just in the last few months here, we have put out alerts here at CISA about a series of vulnerabilities that we score 10 out of 10 on the CVSS and common vulnerability scoring system in terms of just the amount of potential damage they could do if exploited. And just in the last few weeks here, there was we put out an alert about a wormable vulnerability in an SAP NetWeaver application. And then even more recently, a few days ago, there was a Windows DNS server remote code execution vulnerability. All of those 10 out of 10 on the CVSS score. So that just highlights that it's literally day by day here in terms of what we're keeping track of, to work with all of our partners, many on the phone here today, to ensure that collectively we have the threat awareness. But that being said, I would also be the first to tell you that when we look at the world of cybersecurity risk management right now, obviously paying attention to those alerts I just mentioned about some of these high profile vulnerabilities and taking the right remediation action, of course, that is vitally important, and all organizations should do that, and that's basic hygiene and capacity building. But the state of cybersecurity risk management right now is about so much more than just sort of quote unquote patching your stuff. And that's where I think we're starting to see a big trend right now. That's baseline expectation capacity building. And that's where, when I sort of look at the title of today's summit, the cyber and the transformation, that's where we sort of get to the transformation piece. We have seen a significant tectonic shift in the landscape of stakeholders and the interconnectedness of our critical infrastructure community right now. And so the basic cyber blocking and tackling, the cyber hygiene, the vulnerability management, that is of course important. That is the baseline. But the transformation that we're seeing right now is what I think really demands a whole of society and whole of government approach going forward. CISA sits in a really unique perspective here. We have a broad mission as the nation's lead cybersecurity agency, but it kind of falls into two main buckets. One is that we've got a .gov network protection mission. And so many of you are probably familiar with programs like Einstein and CDM, which work across the civilian.gov to secure federal networks, which is, of course, important. The second, which I focus more on, is our critical infrastructure security and resilience mission. And so we sit on top of 16 critical infrastructure sectors: financial services, energy, health and public health, water and wastewater, oil and natural gas, things like that. And we sit on top of them and are able to aggregate all sorts of different pieces of situational awareness and threat information to stitch together a holistic cyber risk picture for the nation. And we've really seen a lot of shifts in this landscape. And in that perch, we're fortunate to be able to look across sort of left to right across a wide critical infrastructure community. And what that visibility has shown us is that this is no longer just about one company or one network. A really static asset organization worldview is no longer going to give you the holistic risk picture to fully understand the threat landscape. And we've seen all sorts of silos broken down in terms of, if you look at the connectedness and interconnectedness and dependencies and interdependencies within and across traditional sectors and industry verticals, it's really hard to look at cyber risk in silos right now. And so we've really seen it's become increasingly hard to disaggregate the disciplines of cybersecurity risk management, supply chain risk management, and critical infrastructure protection. They're all now just sort of intertwined layers on top of each other that you have to deal with in concert. And so that's been a real shift for us over the last few years as we built upon our existing cyber capability in the vulnerability management and in the capacity building and assessment space, and really had to layer on this complicated, interconnected understanding of how the nation's connected infrastructure operates and where are those pinch points and single points of failure and potential opportunities for cascading impact if we're not safe. And so there's a lot of shifts in that space. I think central to all that is this notion that there's an enormous amount of commonality of attack surface right now. And you hear that thrown out a lot. Well, what does that mean? I think if you look at the universe of information and communications technology, ICT, which you frequently hear, the hardware, software, and services, sort of the building blocks of the connected world, if you will. So you've got ICT in one hand, and then on the more operationally focused hand, you've got a bunch of ICS, industrial control systems, which are increasingly digitally connected as well. So they're no longer fully air-gapped offline, they have some connectivity. And there's a lot of commonality of attack surface across those connected underpinning building blocks of our digital infrastructure right now. And so that just sort of increases the need to be extraordinarily vigilant, not just against the threat landscape and the vulnerabilities we face, but it gets better understanding how this web of infrastructure, all connected and interdependent in some way, all underpinned by a relatively common set of hardware, software, and services and other connected industrial componentry, where the risk truly lies there. And that's been an area where we have really continued to lean in, recognizing that cyber adversaries right now, they are looking for that commonality of attack surface to really exploit us and to find ways to cause maximum pain if they can. And a really top of mind example there, if you go back a year and a half or so, you may have seen in the news something called APT-10 Cloud Hopper. This was Advanced Persistent Threat 10 Cloud Hopper vulnerability. This was an exploit and a campaign, a strategic campaign by Chinese-based hackers, state-sponsored hackers, that compromised a series of managed service providers and cloud service providers to extract maximum digital pain by exfiltrating untold amount of intellectual property across dozens of industries in the United States and across dozens of other countries as well. And I think the point there isn't just that there was a cyber incident and a bunch of data was exfiltrated. It was the marrying together the components of what all that means. It means, one, the adversary was acting in a highly strategic way. This was not just a quick hitting, opportunistic, let's compromise some vulnerable equities to get some Bitcoin like we've seen in other actors. This was playing a multi-decade long game of how can we have industrial policy catch up over the course of decades by exfiltrating intellectual property from the United States and other countries around the world. So the strategic nature and intent of the adversary there was extraordinarily important to understand. In line with that, then think about how they did it. They were looking for and I just talked about the commonality of attack surface and how that makes us have to sort of rethink this interconnected infrastructure world. The adversary here was looking for points of leverage they could extract to cause maximum pain. Why just pop one organization or one company or go for one sector when you can kind of find these aggregating layers on top that have the ability to reach in to all of those? And so to me, that's really the telling part about APT-10 Cloud Hopper, which was a Chinese state-backed campaign, is that they didn't just find ways to strategically go after the United States, our companies, our intellectual property, and other allies. They did it in the most efficient, scalable way possible. And that's really a good segue to recognizing, and I mentioned earlier sort of how supply chain risk management and cybersecurity risk management are now inexorably linked. One of the reasons they're inexorably linked, and into this Cloud Hopper example I just gave, is you've got third-party risk is now a foundational part of understanding cybersecurity risk management. And supply chain risk management has gone in the last 3 years from kind of being a peripheral conversation in a lot of cyber circles to now front and center, sort of in line with the reality of the APT-10 Cloud Hopper example that I just gave. So then the question kind of becomes, well, where did this big acceleration and amplification of our awareness and need to better understand supply chain and third-party risk, where did this start? And I don't think there's a demarcation line in the sand necessarily, but for the Department of Homeland Security and my agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, I think really where for us this became something that was a daily part of our mission was probably, let's walk back to the fall of 2017, when we issued a binding operational directive on Kaspersky Labs antivirus software. And this binding operational directive, this is an authority that we take seriously, that we have as the department an ability to promulgate security directives to other executive branch agencies. And what we did is we told them that you have 90 days to take Kaspersky Lab antivirus software out of your network. And we made that decision because we had reached a very defensible and risk-based judgment that opposed an undue risk to the integrity of our networks and our national security to allow this software and the connection that software had to its manufacturer on the networks of the US government. And I think it's a good success story in terms of within 90 days, there was almost full compliance, and we were able to use that policy lever we had to make federal networks incrementally safer, which I think is a good news story. But the biggest takeaway from that is the fact that there was enormous litigation around the Kaspersky Labs binding operational directive, where Kaspersky Labs was accusing the US government of being arbitrary and capricious in the way that it made that decision. And so we had to establish, we had to present that risk-based judgment in a whole bunch of judicial proceedings. And so as we were organizing those thoughts for the courts, we really saw that the methodical process we took arriving to that decision, to make that justified risk-based decision to remove Kaspersky Labs, we really had built unknowingly perhaps, the foundation of third-party trust and assurance supply chain risk management doctrine or framework, if you will. And there were 3 key parts of that. And the first was a technical perspective. If you can make a defensible risk-based argument that from a technical perspective, the product, the hardware, the software, the services, that it's just too risky, it poses an undue risk, then that's a really easy, clean argument right there. And so we went into great length talking about how the antivirus software, before you even talk about the name of the manufacturer or the country the manufacturer is in, it's just a leaky, bad product. And so that was number 1. So we just talked at a very technical perspective about the product. And then 2, we talked about the characteristics of the country of origin. So before we even mentioned the name Russia, we walked through a whole set of characteristics where if manufacturers are based in countries that have these things in terms of an independent judiciary and adequate privacy controls and due process and things like that, that makes us more comfortable with the manufacturer in those countries. And if the manufacturer is in a country that doesn't have those things, then we start to have some serious concern. And so we were able to lay out a set of characteristics. It wasn't just a good or bad list of countries necessarily. Before we even got to that point, it was laying out a set of characteristics around trust. And so that was number 2. Number 1 was the technical specifications of the product. And then number 2 was around the characteristics of trust in a government that the manufacturer of that product may be domiciled in. And then number 3 was relational. It was about what is the relationship between the leadership of the manufacturer of the hardware, software, and service and the leadership of the country that they're domiciled in. And we were able to make a very defensible, risk-based judgment around an uncomfortably cozy relationship between the leadership of Kaspersky Labs and the Russian government, in particular ties to sort of military and intelligence components of that country. And so that was kind of our 1, 2, 3 argument that we were able to lay out about why we felt, and it was justified in the name of national security for the United States, to make that decision. And so while it was the 90-day process was obviously worthwhile in terms of pulling that lever and taking down what we believe firmly was a risky product from Federal Networks, the ensuing litigation was a really interesting reinforcement of how the underpinning argument we had laid out in those 3 buckets and how defensible it was. And ultimately, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, in a 3-year decision, said, yes, you are correct. We agree with your argument and the national security argument that you have laid out. So that was, I think, really reinforcing to us about the validity of sort of laying out that risk-based case and how that can be a good driver of national security. I think it's really interesting, something else that came out of that decision, and I was having a conversation with the CISO of a quite large American city recently. He said, hey, I have been wanting to take Kaspersky Labs off my networks, of my city networks, for some time, and I just didn't feel like I had the top cover. I felt like I was opening myself up to civil litigation, of potentially being sued for being arbitrary or capricious or trying to wade into global geopolitics, as opposed to just kind of doing my technical job as a CISO. And he was saying, I really wanted to make that decision. I couldn't until you all, the US government, gave us that top cover. Once you made that decision, and then it went through the litigation process and your risk judgments were validated, that was the North Star that I needed to be able to point to and say, no, I'm doing this because if that product, that software, that service, if it's bad for the national security and Federal networks, then I think it poses a risk to my city networks as well. And so that was a really telling moment for me, and kind of humbling and empowering, to be honest, because it said that that North Star that we put up, aside from the discrete action of what we were able to action on Federal networks, that North Star that we put up with defensible underlying risk judgments beneath it, that other people pay notice to that. And that really got me thinking about, we always talk about how cybersecurity is a team sport, and it takes the executive branch, and it takes Capitol Hill and industry stakeholders and third-party and security researchers and academia, all of them coming together. And as someone who currently works for the government, it got me thinking of, well, what is the thing that government uniquely can do and add value to? Because that was a really nice example for me of reinforcement from a stakeholder in the state and local community of saying, that was a place where you and only you alone could add that value, and we needed that. And so that was really helpful, because there's the threat landscape being what it is, duplication of effort is never helpful. And so to the extent you can needle in on, well, what are the areas where we can uniquely add value, and then where can we partner with others in different areas, I think that's going to help us get to the spot we want to be. And so I think that's a good segue for me to sort of highlight, with that in mind, where can the US government, where can my agency, CISA, add unique value going forward? I think we've got some exciting things on the horizon here over the coming months. And one area we're going to try to continue to mature our understanding of, but of course working with partners, is continue to connect vulnerability management with risk management. And on the surface, those may sound like sort of the same thing. And I mentioned the SAP and then the Windows vulnerabilities earlier, as vulnerability management will continue to be a core part of basic cyber hygiene and best network practices. But in a world where we are seemingly swimming in vulnerabilities, how do we understand the connection between remediation of vulnerabilities and risk management outcomes, not just for companies and organizations, but since everything is interconnected, for the larger critical infrastructure community in the nation? And so I don't think we're going to get to sort of a scientific decimal place quantification of that, but I think this is an area that's really ripe for continued engagement of maturing the study and the discipline of connecting cyber vulnerability management with cyber risk management outcomes. And so that's an area I think you'll see us continue to focus on over the coming year or so here. And core to that is the ability to add some metrics to cyber loss. And this has been a really vexing problem that I think will continue to be sort of a whole of community and whole of critical infrastructure community effort going forward. One of the reasons it has been difficult to sort of definitively connect vulnerability management with cyber risk management, it's been a very imperfect science, for no fault of anyone, of quantifying cyber loss. You know, there are some very direct losses from cyber incidents, you know, the actual money you have to spend on remediation or reconstitution of your networks. And then perhaps if there's a fine from the breach or some sort of civil penalty, obviously that's quite easy to quantify. But then there are other things that are much harder to quantify. What is the true cost of intellectual property that's exfiltrated? Recognizing we might not realize that loss for decades in some instances, as I was talking about that Chinese APT10 issue earlier. And then reputational risk, how do you quantify that? And so I think we'll continue to see a maturation of the science and the discipline of how we quantify cyber loss, recognizing that some of those buckets are going to be easier to understand and some are always going to be a little bit more murky. And there's not going to be a perfect decimal place answer to all this, but if we can even add some sort of directional and tiering clarity, I think that will be really valuable for the broader cybersecurity and cyber risk management community. So that's another area, those metrics around cyber loss that within the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, that's going to continue to be a part of our cyber risk management portfolio going forward. And we look forward to continuing to lean into that and working with partners as is necessary. And then a third area we're going to continue leaning into is around better understanding in this interconnected systems of systems world, the criticality and the comparative criticality of the underpinning building blocks, the hardware, software, and services that make up the connected world. And, you know, it's kind of an overused phrase sometimes these days, but if everything is critical, nothing is critical. And when we look at across the ICT and ICS ecosystem and how those hardware, software, services, third parties, other components, how they all stitch together to collectively enable the functions that the American people need, whether it's our IT functions or it's electricity or it's the processing of financial transactions, some portions, some building blocks within those chains are more critical than others, or if degraded, the consequence will be higher. And we need to start to understand at a more detailed level with more fidelity the comparative criticality of these digital building blocks, if you will. And CISA has started doing that already with work we did in support of an executive order that came out last May. And this was the executive order on securing the information communications technologies and services supply chain. And it gives the Department of Commerce authorities there around certain transactions for the ICT ecosystem that may be of unacceptable risk to the nation. But DHS and CISA, we provided decision support, vulnerability and risk analysis of the ICT ecosystem. And what we did is we took the big world of information communications technologies and services, and we boiled it down to ultimately get to 61 underpinning elements. So we got down to the granularity of sort of your server, your router, your base station controller, your satellite uplink cable, things like that. So that was a level of granularity and was a really helpful taxonomy for us for the first time to sort of deconstruct the connected world into the underpinning building blocks. And then from there, we did criticality analysis in terms of understanding if degraded, what would be the consequence on the overall system, recognizing that these systems have all sorts of functions that the American people depend upon. And so that was a really helpful exercise for us. We are continuing to doing work there because we think that is vitally important going forward, is to better understand criticality in this complicated, interconnected systems of world. And I think that is how we can sort of fully stitch together the threat, as I talked about China and obviously other cyber actors, the vulnerability, talked about how we live in this sea of vulnerabilities right now, some of higher severity than others, and how patching is important, but it doesn't necessarily translate directly to a risk management outcome. better understanding some of the metrics around quantification of cyber loss and cyber incident, and then continuing to mature our understanding of criticality across the connected systems in America. When you stitch that all together, I think we're really going to together advance our understanding of cybersecurity risk management and how we can buy down risk for the nation, for the organizations that service the critical infrastructure community, and generally just have a positive outcome for the cyber resilience of the nation. So central to all of that is going to be partnership. None of that can be done alone. And I know you're going to hear from more speakers later today about some of the issues we're facing. And I think they'll say the same message, is everyone plays a role in this. And so when we talk about stitching together and maturing the understanding of threat, vulnerability, consequence to drive the risk management outcomes we all want, that's a good thing. We all know where we want to get to. It's going to continue to require partnership. And so I think events like this are a really helpful way of continuing the conversation, but have enjoyed kicking things off this morning with some thoughts. And I know we have a little time for some Q&A here, but again, really appreciate the opportunity to share CISA's perspective on this important issue. So Thelma, thank you.
No, thank you, Director Kroese. Wow, what a way to start the morning. There has been a tremendous outpouring of interest, and it is here in the list of questions that have come in through your talk this morning. And so I see we have quite a few. I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best. So looking here, our first question coming in from one of our government partners. Could you discuss how federal agencies protect, defend, and secure supply chain against cyber threats? And then also discuss the challenges that arise as technology becomes more fundamental to supply chains?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question. And as I mentioned earlier, I think sometimes we fall into this trap of trying to silo related disciplines. And in my day-to-day job, I have a really hard time disaggregating cybersecurity risk management, supply chain / third-party vendor risk management, and just broader critical infrastructure protection efforts. And I think that's not a bad thing. It highlights the way that these are all interwoven at the moment. In terms of what the government is doing right now around supply chain security, there have been a number of really significant developments over the last few years. I'll talk about two that we're quite involved in. One is, so I mentioned that Kaspersky Labs example. That was kind of a one-off lever that the Department of Homeland Security pulled. And, we have had other binding operational directives before, but there's recognition that we want really sort of harmonized activity across the U.S. government of when we think a manufacturer and entity poses undue risk of being able to take action accordingly. And so in legislation enacted at the end of 2018, the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Act, it created this Federal Acquisition Security Council that is being stood up as we speak. And the Federal Acquisition Security Council really has three main pillars of it. It's got civilian.gov through DHS and CISA. It's got the Department of Defense and the military world, and it's got the intelligence community represented by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And so it's got all three of those agency heads there sitting as principals, those three stools, if you will, who are able to go through and make together exclusion and removal orders across all three of the domains they have jurisdiction over, the .mil, the .gov, and the IC. And so that is getting operationalized as we speak. And, it's led by Grant Schneider from the Office of Management and Budget, and he has said that he expects in the not too distant future the rulemaking that kind of provides the governance for that to be released. And so we are very close to having this operational body that can actually make in concert across those three domains exclusion and removal orders for untrusted vendors and equipment. And so I think that's a really welcome development and one that brings together all the right stakeholders. Second one on the partnership side is DHS CISA. We run and oversee the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which has really been a groundbreaking partnership effort where we bring together 20 of the key interagency players in supply chain risk management. We bring together 20 industry leaders from the communications sector and then 20 industry leaders from the IT sector, and then hundreds of other SMEs to really tackle some of the longer term strategic supply chain challenges that we face. And right now there's a number of working groups and efforts that we're chewing on. One that I'll highlight for everyone here in terms of just where supply chain risk management kind of demands its dedicated study is we have a working group around info sharing concerns for supply chain threats right now. And many of you are probably aware in 2015, there was a huge legislative push around providing liability protection for the bidirectional sharing of cyber threat indicators between industry and government. And that was enacted. That was seen as a very positive move for this ecosystem. When we're talking about sharing cyber threat indicators, those are often technical ones and zeros. When we're talking about sharing supply chain threat information, what we're really talking about is companies sharing their judgment calls and their risk judgment on other entities. A company may have been deciding what vendor to use for some IT service, and they decided with a vendor and against other vendors, perhaps because they had some concerns about those vendors. So if they have concerns about those vendors, that is a potential supply chain risk for the nation. But how did they share that judgment, recognizing that it may be imperfect, it may be qualitative in nature to some degree? How do they share that for the benefit of the community without opening themselves up to enormous civil litigation risk and sort of anti-competitive behavior and things like that? And so that is one thing that this task force is looking at right now. We'll have some, I think, some pretty telling recommendations later on in the fall as it hits its 2-year mark, but around how do we think about the information sharing concerns around supply chain threat information, which are inherently about judgments of manufacturers, and how are those different from existing conversations we have had about information sharing for more technical and oftentimes anonymized cyber threat indicators. And so that's been an interesting conversation that has come out of this task force, which has been a great sort of center of gravity, if you will, for partnership on supply chain risk management. And I think it complements quite well on the federal side, that Federal Acquisition Security Council I mentioned, which is getting up and running as we speak. So plenty more to come on the supply chain front in the federal government.
Thank you. One of our media affiliates has asked if you would discuss the challenging and evolving cyber threat landscape associated with emerging technologies.
Sure, absolutely. And so emerging technology means a bunch of different things to a bunch of different people, but I have spent a good deal of my time over the last 2 years here focused on 5G networks and the risk around 5G networks. And this has been a really exciting time, but sort of with high stakes to work in the US government and to first of all, about understanding how 5G will fundamentally transform every aspect of our society. It's about more than just 100 times faster download speeds, and you can download a high-def video on your phone in 1.2 seconds or something like that. It's recognizing that this will be the new way of connectivity over the next few decades here. And we talk about autonomous vehicles and smart cities and telehealth and all these other industrial applications of 5G. The data integrity concerns there are greater than ever before. And one of the central to the 5G conversation has been around this concept of, do you trust the vendors who make this? And what makes 5G so much different, and you talked about, well, what is an emerging technology? One of the fundamental differences from 5G compared to previous 4G and 4G LTE buildouts is the role of software in 5G networks. And a lot is virtualized in 5G networks that previously were done by sort of physical switches in previous network versions. And so there's all sorts of ability to have software-defined networking where the software is operating the functionality where before it wasn't. And this presents a lot of opportunity for things like network slicing and enhanced functionality of these networks, but it also poses an enormous risk where if you don't have trust and assurance in that software or the manufacturer of that software, then you potentially set yourself up for massive data integrity issues. And with 5G, the data integrity issues aren't just about privacy or intellectual property. When we're talking about the industrial use cases, the data that underpins and transits 5G networks, that'll power a whole host of use cases where if compromised, there are conceivable public health and safety issues from that as well. And so you really, with 5G, there's no other way to cut it. You have got to have trust and assurance in the vendors who make that, recognizing how hard it is to have post-deployment software assurance in 5G networks. And really interesting studies, what the UK study came out about from their Huawei Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and then an independent researcher, Finite State, what they did, analyzing the firmware of a bunch of Huawei 5G routers. It becomes abundantly clear that the security culture at that company simply leaves too much room to be desired for. And then even on top of that, when you're talking about software-defined networking, you're going to have monthly firmware refreshes. And so that's standard cybersecurity practice. And so when you're having millions of lines of code, exponentially more code than 4G, it's really hard to have post-deployment software assurance because the code is just changing too fast. And so whether it's a bug door or a backdoor really becomes irrelevant because there is just too much of a chance of vulnerabilities across that software that could result in a lack of data integrity. And that's really where the US government and our position on untrusted manufacturers such as Huawei, that's really where that has stemmed from. Is it you marry the strategic intent of China, I mentioned APT-10 Cloud Hopper, you marry that with their demonstrated activity, and I mentioned obviously APT-10 and the data exfiltration, the intelligence laws in that country, which compel private sector engagement in ways that the United States does not have. And then the realities of the architecture and componentry of 5G networks that are software heavy, or even with the best intentions and the best testing labs, is almost impossible to have post-deployment software assurance where you can fully understand that code is vulnerability free at any given point. You bake all that up together, and the US government has reached what we believe is a very defensible risk judgment based on untrusted vendors, particularly those from China. And I think we are heartened to see this week the decisions that came out of the UK to actually start to tack towards our position and make their networks Huawei free from by 2027. It was a recognition of a lot of what I just laid out here, that in software heavy networks that will underpin the connected world for the coming decades, you need to have trust and assurance in the software in those networks, in the manufacturers of who makes those networks, and in the intent of the company where those manufacturers are domiciled in. And if you go for 0 for 3 on that equation, that probably tells you something in terms of the level of trust that you need with other alternatives for that emerging technology.
Thank you. We have another question from one of our industry partners that's extremely timely considering our current environment. What are the cyber lessons learned during the COVID-19 response? Can you discuss the security risk with remote working?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And at a high level, when you think back to early March and April, there was a mass shift to telework. And so we're just going to have more throughput and more taxing on our systems than we've ever had before with people working from home. The good news story here, and then I'll share a cautionary note at the end. The good news story is that in terms of the overall resilience of our communications and IT networks during COVID, when there's been mass shifts to telework, they have been remarkably resilient, right? You saw pockets of disruption or throughput issues, but by and large, America's ability to shift to telework heavy and virtual environments, I think has been something that has been a decent success story of all of this. That being said, there are a whole host of security concerns when you have people not working from their corporate networks, but working from their home networks all of a sudden. And a lot of the issues we saw early on where people were having a hard time transitioning, it wasn't necessarily that the capacity or the underpinning of the internet didn't have enough redundancy or resilience. It may have just been that their company, in terms of the number of concurrent user subscriptions for VPN networks, because they only had a small percentage of people working at home at any given point, they just didn't have an actually sort of at an enterprise level brought on that capacity to enable that. And so there was a little bit of kind of a last mile company problem we saw that admittedly was fixed rather quickly over sort of 10 days or 2 weeks as companies realized where they had to sort of dial up the capacity they had and what they were paying for to enable safe work at home environments. But when people are connecting and doing their corporate work, which even if it's not classified, certainly may have intellectual property or trade secrets like that, when they're doing that from their home networks, again, it really broadens the attack surface. And so how safe are those home networks, right? you may have someone who, because they've got a Nest home camera or a baby camera or something like that, which is an IoT device where they never change the default password away from what it was. If they're working at home now, that may be actually a way for an adversary to get into their corporate network inadvertently that didn't exist before. And so that's not necessarily anything against the overall resilience of our information communications networks. It's just a reality that when your home network now becomes your office network, you really have to think through, is my home network and the connected things on my home network and the security posture of that home network, is that fortified to the way that my enterprise would have done that on-prem? And CISA has put out a whole bunch of teleworking guidance around this. And so I encourage you to go to CISA's website, CISA.gov, and check out a lot of the telework guidance we put out, which is in that spirit that I just mentioned. What are the things people can do if they're now conducting their enterprise business at home to ensure that their home network has adequate security?
Director Kroese, how does an organization foster a culture of cyber readiness?
Yeah, that's a great question. Encourage you off the bat here to check out the CISA Cyber Essentials, where we lay out a bunch of things and we break it into different categories. The technical network operators, but then you as the user, that you can do to foster a culture of readiness. A lot of it starts with the person. You know, you can patch every vulnerability in the world and have the most robust network security apparatus, but you're still going to find people who sort of click the proverbial link, if you will. And so a culture of security is not just about your IT cycles and the layers of security you have and decisions you make about on-prem versus cloud and your subscription to threat feeds and how quickly you mitigate severe vulnerabilities. People are a huge portion of that. And I think if you look at the annual Verizon cyber breach report, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's something pretty high, like 30% of breaches, I believe, are actually the result of human behavior. And so that's, I think, a message I would leave for everyone here is don't underestimate the importance of investing in resilient behavior by your employees. Oftentimes, you have done everything else right, and that is the way that there's a cyber incident. It's just best practices by the employees themselves. So encourage you to check out the CISA Cyber Essentials on CISA.gov, and that can go over more of sort of how you can foster the culture of resilience. But a big takeaway, don't forget the importance of the people. That matters too.
One of your government counterparts is asking, how is your agency fostering diversity into information security? What does the cyber workforce of tomorrow look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's no secret that there are massive amounts, it's something, a large percentage of cyber positions in this country remain unfilled. And I think the, different estimates from different organizations, but it's a number of information security jobs is in the millions that are unfilled right now. And so that is an enormous opportunity for everyone to hire the future information security professionals of tomorrow that look like and represent America as a whole. That's a huge commitment of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and it's a commitment of Director Krebs, who is our leader. So diversity and inclusion is a huge part of our agency's mission. It's particularly relevant now when we're looking at how, when we, like every other organization, we have vacancies in a lot of our cyber and information security jobs. And we want to have an agency that reflects America. So that's going to continue to be important from the top down, something that we take very seriously, and continuing to work on ways to speed up the hiring process. I think a way of getting diverse and unique backgrounds and perspectives of candidates in is as we continue to find ways for that pipeline of people coming to work for the federal government and lending their talents. That's going to be part of it. I think, of course, there's a lot of conversations right now around how we can better have sort of the tour of duty concept where people from the private sector can come to government for a few years and then go back. The partnership for public service in conjunction with some private sector partners like MasterCard and Workday and Microsoft have a good effort right now around how that tour of duty can be facilitated. So I think that's a key part of it. You can bring some candidates into the federal government that maybe hadn't taken a traditional path like others had. So I think all of that is a part of it. And I think the overall takeaway for us right now is we very much want to have a cybersecurity infrastructure security agency that looks like America. And right now, across all agencies and all entities that are trying to hire in cybersecurity roles, the reality is that there are vacancies, and we're all working diligently to fill those. And we continue to work on initiatives that help at a young level, sort of the K through 12 level in high school and vocational and two-year college, making sure that people have that skill set early on so that the pipeline is strong. It's easier to hire a diverse cyber workforce that looks like America if we also have that pipeline as well. So we're engaged at all levels of this conversation. There's no silver bullet, but it is a vitally important issue. So I appreciate it being raised.
I think we have, if you can bear with us, just 2 to 3 more questions. What advice would you have for cyber rising stars?
For cyber rising stars, well, the federal government, and to get parochial here, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency would love you. So that's a good to have you. So that's a good segue from the last conversation I had, and I would encourage them to reach out to CISA, and we have a hiring fair coming up at the end of the month. Actually, it starts on July 27th, I believe, a virtual hiring fair. So I can tell them if that's helpful. I can send you information from that following up here. But we want to get young people in early on. And I think that's for all cyber agencies and all cyber organizations. It's not just about recruiting and hiring that really talented and experienced sort of 45-year-old mid-career executive. It's how can we hire that hard charging, hungry 22-year-old out of college as well and get them in the ranks early. So I'll send you some information afterwards on this hiring fair. And obviously I got the mic now, so I get to be a little parochial, but and obviously there are other hiring fairs for other agencies going on here, but it's an important time. And to the extent that people young want to find a foot into the U.S. government and be part of the Homeland Security, national security, and cybersecurity conversation early, we would certainly welcome that. So please come our way.
Thank you for that. I will look forward to that information, and we will share it with our affiliates as well. One last question, actually 2 questions. So this question is coming in from a media affiliate. It's often said that cyber is a team sport. How so?
I think to an earlier point I made, if you look at the role of government, the role of industry, the role of different parts of government, both the executive branch and the Hill, the role of people in academia and the think tank world, the independent security research world, all of those matter right now. The role of state and local governments, if you look at a lot of the work we're doing right now in election security, engaging over 2,500 counties directly right now as we ensure that we protect the integrity of the 2020 election, which is a top mission of our agency right now. We are dealing there with election vendors, with state officials, with county officials, with CISA, DHS, the intelligence community, briefing the Hill frequently. So I think that's a really good top of mind example for me right now when it comes to something vitally important for the nation, like securing the 2020 election. It is a whole society, whole of government effort. So team sport is a nice way of sort of encapsulating that. It's a phrase I have used often as well, but I don't think it's a cliche in this sense. I think it's actually what we're seeing play out day to day.
Thank you. And finally, what key takeaways would you share with this government, industry, and media audience today?
I think the main key takeaway here is that, again, I'll use the last question as a segue. Cyber is indeed a team sport. I think we have more awareness and more interest in being part of the cybersecurity conversation than ever before. The landscape is totally changing here. And as I said, the intersection of cyber vulnerability management, of third-party supply chain risk management, of infrastructure protection, these are all a part of the larger foundational conversation about, in a digitally connected world, how do we have integrity in the data and the systems that hold that data that underpin our way of life as Americans. And so it is all converging right now, but that is an exciting time to be part of these conversations and really why we need summits like this.
Well, thank you, Director Kroese, for your insightful comments on the challenging and evolving cyber threat landscape, the importance of partnerships, and CISA's critical role in cyberspace. I hope that you can hear and feel the virtual applause.
I'll take your word for it. Thank you, Thelma.
It's been my pleasure.